There is a single line in Miriam Holt's diary, written on a Thursday in late June of 1857, somewhere on the flat scrub plain east of Fort Laramie, that her descendants have never quite known what to make of. She wrote, "He offered his hand at the crossing. I did not take it. I wonder now how many times he will offer before he stops." That was all. No explanation, no name. She left the page there and moved on to the next day's entry, which described the temperature, the condition of her oxen, and the fact that her son Henry had finally stopped coughing. But if you read the diary from the beginning, all 47 pages of it, written in pencil on paper so thin you can nearly see through it, you begin to understand what she was really saying. Not just about the man at the crossing, about everything she had decided about herself before she ever left Ohio. Miriam Holt was 34 years old in the spring of 1857. She had buried a husband 2 years prior, fever, February, gone in 12 days, and she had spent those 2 years doing the arithmetic of her situation with the kind of precision that grief tends to produce. The farm was mortgaged. The mortgage could not be paid. Her husband's brother had land in the Willamette Valley. 200 acres he could not work alone, and he had written to say that if she could get herself and Henry to Oregon, the land would be divided and she would have her peace. A home. Not borrowed. Not inherited. Hers. She had done the arithmetic on that too. 2,170 miles. Roughly 5 months of walking if everything went as it should. The cost of joining a wagon train. The cost of a wagon, 2 oxen, supplies enough to last. She had sold everything that could be sold, the furniture, the winter curtains, the extra plow, and she had come up with almost exactly enough. Almost. She had borrowed the last $40 from her sister Agnes, who had pressed the money into her hand at the Missouri River crossing in early May and said, "Don't you dare apologize for this," and Miriam had nodded and not apologized, and spent the next 3 weeks waking at night thinking about those $40 as if they were a stone she had agreed to carry the whole way to Oregon. That was Miriam's particular affliction. Not fear of the trail, not fear of the mountains or the river crossings or the cholera that moved through wagon trains like smoke through a cracked window. Those things frightened her, of course. Any sane woman was frightened by them. What frightened Miriam Holt more than any of that was the possibility that she would need help and someone would have to give it. She had been told, at various points in her life, that she was proud. Her mother had said it gently, meaning it as a warning. Her husband had said it with something like admiration. Her sister Agnes had said it the way you say something about a person you love and cannot change. And Miriam did not disagree with any of them exactly. She only felt that proud was the wrong word for what it actually was. She had been a burden once. She did not intend to be one again. She had been 17 when her father's illness took the family's savings and then the farm, and she had watched her mother divide herself into pieces, moving in with one sister, then another, apologizing at every threshold, always careful to take up as little space as possible. And Miriam had decided then, at 17, sitting on the steps of a house that was no longer theirs, that she would spend the rest of her life making certain she never put that look on anyone's face. The look that was not quite resentment and not quite obligation, but was the particular exhaustion of a person who would never say you are too much, but sometimes thought it in the dark. She would not be that for anyone. So she drove her own wagon. She repaired her own harness when it cracked at the second river crossing on the 16th of May, while the rest of the train waited, and she did not ask for help, though it took her nearly an hour and her hands bled a little at the end. She managed Henry and the oxen and the daily decisions about water and rest and pace, and she did it without complaint and without assistance, and she felt, those first 6 weeks on the trail, something very close to peace. And then she met Caleb Marsh. He was camped 2 wagons ahead of her in the train organized by Captain Aldous Webb out of Independence, Missouri, a train of 23 wagons that left on the 4th of May and would be reduced to 19 by the time it reached Fort Hall in late August, for reasons that do not need to be stated here. Caleb Marsh was 41 years old, a farmer from Indiana with a 12-year-old daughter named Clara, and he was the kind of man who was easy to overlook until you needed something, at which point you found that he had already noticed the problem and was quietly working on a solution. He had been a widower for 3 years. He did not talk about it much. Clara talked about her mother sometimes, in the particular way children do when they are still learning which memories are safe to handle and which ones still cut, carefully, and then all at once, and then carefully again. Miriam had not been looking for company. She had not been looking for a great deal of anything except forward motion. But on the 28th of May, when the oxen of the Harmon family 3 wagons back broke through the crust of an alkali flat, and one of them had to be put down, and the train stopped for 2 hours while the situation was sorted, Caleb Marsh had walked back along the line of wagons to check on each one, the way a man does when stopping costs something and he wants to make certain the cost is not wasted. He had reached Miriam's wagon and looked at the harness she had repaired and said, with no particular expression, "That's a good splice, better than I'd have done." Miriam had looked at him for a moment, and then said, "It held, at least." He had nodded and moved on, and that was the whole of their first conversation. But he had noticed the harness, and she had noticed that he noticed. The trail east of Fort Laramie, in the summer of 1857, was not the worst it had ever been, and not the best. The Platte River Valley section, some 400 miles of it, was flat enough to travel quickly but brutal in other ways. The river water was silty and often undrinkable without boiling. The afternoon heat in late May and June could reach temperatures that made the air above the ground shimmer and shift like something alive. The dust was constant, fine as flour, and it found its way into everything. The food, the water barrels, the corners of your eyes, the folds of whatever you wore. Miriam's diary entries from this stretch are practical, brief, almost businesslike. She records the miles, the weather, the condition of Henry's health. She notes when they passed Chimney Rock on June 14th, a strange column of rock rising from the plain like a chimney from a house that is not there, and when they reached Scott's Bluff 3 days later. She notes that the train lost a mule and gained a new baby on the same afternoon, the latter belonging to a Mrs. Enid Barrows, who named him Franklin and nursed him through the night without complaint, which Miriam records with something that reads like quiet admiration. She does not write Caleb Marsh's name until the entry for June 19th, and when she does, she writes it almost incidentally. Mr. Marsh brought a pot of rabbit stew to the wagon. Henry ate 2 portions. I told him it was not necessary. He said Henry looked hungry. I did not argue with that. She crosses out the next sentence. In the original diary, you can still read it if you tilt the page toward the light. He did not stay. The stew appeared again on June 23rd, then again on July 1st, when it was not rabbit but some kind of prairie grouse that Clara had caught in a snare she'd made herself, which impressed Miriam more than she allowed herself to say. By this point, the train had pushed west through Scott's Bluff and was bearing down on Fort Laramie, and the pace had picked up because Captain Webb was watching the sky and watching the calendar and doing his own arithmetic about how much of summer remained. Miriam's ankle gave out on July 6th. She had twisted it 3 days before, a misstep in the dark, checking the wagon at midnight, the kind of small careless accident that happens when you are tired and doing more than one person was ever meant to do alone. She had wrapped it with a strip torn from a petticoat, laced her boot tight, and said nothing. She walked on it for 3 days because there was no alternative she was willing to accept. On the morning of July 6th, the train was preparing to move out at first light, and Miriam climbed down from the wagon to check the traces, and her left leg simply refused. Not pain exactly, though there was pain, but a kind of complete and sudden refusal, the body announcing a limit she had not consulted it about. She caught herself on the wagon wheel. Henry was still asleep. No one had seen, no one except Caleb Marsh, who was already moving toward her from 2 wagons forward before she had time to arrange her face into something that suggested nothing was wrong. "Sit down," he said. Not a question, not an order exactly, just a statement of what was going to happen. "I'm fine," she said. "It's nothing." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has learned not to argue with things that are plainly false. Then he looked at her boot. "Can you walk on it?" She considered lying. She decided not to. Not today. What he did next was not what she expected. He did not offer to help her to the wagon. He did not call anyone over. He did not make it into something larger than it was. He walked around to the other side of the wagon, spoke quietly to Henry, who had by now woken up and was watching with the wide, calculating attention of an 8-year-old assessing a situation his mother preferred he not assess. And then he drove the wagon himself. For the full 12 miles they made that day, while Miriam sat in the wagon bed with her foot wrapped in a wet compress made from a cloth she didn't ask the source of. She tried once to tell him it was not his responsibility. He said, "I know." She tried again, 2 miles later, to say that she was capable of managing her own affairs. He said, "I don't doubt it." And then nothing more was said on the subject, and they made 12 miles, and that evening Henry told her solemnly that Mr. Marsh had let him hold the reins for a quarter mile, and that he thought Mr. Marsh was probably the best driver in the whole train. And Miriam looked at the roof of the wagon canvas and was quiet for a long time. She wrote in her diary that night, "He offered his hand at the crossing. I did not take it. I wonder now how many times he will offer before he stops." The ankle healed in 5 days. Not fully, but enough. She was walking again by July 11th, though with a slight care that would last another 2 weeks. During those 5 days, Caleb drove the wagon each morning without being asked and without any discussion. Clara rode beside him sometimes and taught Henry card games Miriam was not entirely sure she approved of but did not stop. In the evenings, Caleb built the fire for both camps without arranging it as a gift or a favor, just a thing that needed doing that he happened to be doing, and Miriam found, to her own irritation, that she could not find a way to object to it that didn't sound foolish. It was Clara who broke through first, the way children sometimes do, without strategy, without mercy. She came to sit beside Miriam on the evening of July 13th, while the men of the train were gathered around Captain Webb's wagon discussing water sources ahead, and Clara sat down in the particular way she had of occupying space as if she'd always been there. "Papa says you drove all the way from Ohio by yourself," she said. "With Henry," Miriam said, "but Henry's 8. He was very helpful." Clara considered this. "Papa says most women wouldn't have made it to the Missouri River alone." A pause. He didn't say it like it was bad. He said it like he meant it. Miriam did not answer for a moment. The fire was low. The prairie dark was coming in from all sides, vast and indifferent, and the sound of the other campfires and voices was oddly comforting against it. "Your father is kind," she finally said. "He's lonely," Clara said, with the directness of a child who has observed something for 3 years and is tired of no one mentioning it. Then she stood up and went to her own fire, and left Miriam sitting with that. Fort Laramie, reached on July 18th, was the first real stopping point. A place where you could rest the animals, repair what had broken, resupply if you had money left, and write letters home if you still had someone to write them to. Captain Webb gave them 2 full days, which felt like a luxury after 74 days of trail. Miriam wrote a long letter to Agnes and mailed it with the fort's eastbound rider, and she sat for a while afterward thinking about what she had written and what she had left out. She had not mentioned Caleb Marsh. She did not examine too carefully why. What she knew was this: she had started this journey with a very clear idea of what she was allowed to need. She was allowed to need land and safety and a future for Henry. She was not allowed to need company, or warmth, or someone who would drive her wagon for 5 days without making her feel she had failed at something. She was not allowed to need someone to offer his hand at a river crossing. She did not know what to do with a man who offered it anyway, and did not seem bothered by whether she took it. She found him that evening at the edge of the fort's trading post, looking at a bolt of fabric in the pale gold color that was apparently one of the few things the fort currently had in good supply. He looked slightly baffled by it, which was the most unguarded expression she had seen on him in 7 weeks. "Clara's birthday," he said, when she appeared beside him. She said once she wanted a yellow dress. Miriam looked at the fabric. "That's more of a mustard," she said. She probably meant something lighter. He accepted this without defensiveness. "Do you know what she meant?" "I might," Miriam said. And she looked through what the trading post had, and found a pale primrose cotton tucked behind 3 bolts of brown wool, and held it up, and he said, "Yes, that's it," with the relief of a man who has been trying to solve a problem for some time, and is grateful to find someone who can simply solve it. They walked back through the fort together. The evening was cooler than it had been in weeks, the high Wyoming altitude doing what July in Indiana never managed, and the stars were coming out in a wash that still surprised her every night. She had not grown up under a sky this large. "You've been driving your wagon since Ohio," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Since Kansas City," she said. "We came from Ohio by train. You and Henry alone." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't say that to make a point of it. I say it because it means something. It means I had no one else," she said, and there was more edge in it than she intended. He did not flinch from it. "That's one way to read it," he said. "I read it as meaning you are the sort of woman who finds a way." She did not know what to say to that. She said nothing, and they walked the rest of the way in silence, and she was not sure if it was a comfortable silence or a charged one, only that it did not feel empty. The next morning, before the train pulled out of Fort Laramie, Caleb Marsh knocked on the side of her wagon and waited until she appeared. "Miriam," he said. He had not called her by her given name before. "I want to ask you something, and I'd like you to hear the whole of it before you decide." She waited. From here to South Pass is another 150 miles, and the terrain gets harder. Past that, through Fort Bridger and into Idaho, harder still. "I think you know that." He paused. "What I'm proposing is not that you can't manage it. I'm not proposing that at all. What I'm proposing is that two wagons traveling close have twice the eyes and twice the hands when something goes wrong, and things will go wrong. I'm asking you to travel beside me. Not behind, beside." Another pause. "That's the whole of it." Miriam looked at him for a long moment. "I will not be a burden to you," she said. "I know that," he said. "I'm not asking you to be." Then, very simply, "I am nobody's burden either. I'm asking you to walk beside me." She did not answer him immediately. She turned and looked at Henry, who was pretending to check the wheel but was very obviously listening, and then she looked back at Caleb, and what she saw was not pity and not obligation and not the particular exhaustion of a man who felt he owed her something. What she saw was a man who was also tired of carrying things alone, and was extending that tiredness toward her honestly, without dressing it up as charity. "All right," she said. That was all. All right. The miles after Fort Laramie were the hardest of the journey. The road to South Pass climbed through land that grew drier and stranger with every day. The Sweetwater River Valley, where the water was sweet enough to be startling after weeks of alkali taste, and then the long ascending plain toward the Continental Divide. The elevation made the nights cold even in July, and Miriam began keeping Henry close at night, both of them under every blanket she had brought. She and Caleb drove their wagons abreast when the trail allowed, and side by side they saw the same things, which is different from seeing things alone in ways that are hard to articulate. When a hawk circled high above the Sweetwater on a Tuesday morning, and Clara pointed it out and all four of them watched it together without speaking, that was something different from watching alone. When Henry found an arrowhead in the dust at the base of a rock formation and held it up with the gravity of a boy who understands he has found something old, and Caleb told him something about the Shoshone people who had traveled this land for generations before any wagon wheel ever turned on it, that conversation had a different texture than the silence would have had. South Pass came on the 7th of August, mile 947 of the trail, the highest point of the crossing at 7,400 feet, the place where the continent divides and the water runs west instead of east. Captain Webb made everyone stop at the monument stone and let the moment be what it was. Some of the men took off their hats. One of the women from a Missouri family sat down on the ground and wept, though she laughed at herself afterward. Miriam did not weep. She stood and looked west and felt something shift that had been held tight for so long she had stopped knowing it was tight. She wrote in her diary that night, "We are past the middle of it. Everything from here runs toward Oregon." She did not write what Caleb said when they stood at the pass together, which was simply, "You did well today." And she did not write what she said back, which was, "So did you." But those two sentences, said quietly at the top of the continent while the wind came through the pass cold and constant and indifferent to all of them, those were the whole of what needed saying. The second half of the trail was not easier. It was never easier. The Snake River Plain in Idaho was 150 miles of volcanic rock and sand that was hard on hooves and harder on wheels, and the dust was different there, darker, finer, almost black, and it coated everything with a quality that was less like dirt and more like ash. The Snake River crossings were genuinely dangerous, the current fast and deep and cold even in August, and at the crossing near Fort Boise on the 2nd of September, one of the rear wagons in the train lost a wheel in the river, and 2 trunks went downstream and were not recovered. Miriam did not hesitate at that crossing. She drove straight through, eyes forward, and Caleb rode beside her on horseback with his hand near her lead ox's head in case it shied, and they came out the other side with everything they had started with. She breathed once, hard, and kept moving. The Blue Mountains of Oregon arrived in mid-September, steep and forested and smelling of pine in a way that made the women of the train close their eyes when they entered the tree line, because it smelled like Ohio, or Indiana, or wherever home had been. The wagons had to be lowered down the steeper descents with ropes, the men straining against the weight of them, and there were 3 days in those mountains that Miriam would later say were the hardest of her life. The grade, the cold that came at night without warning, the constant vigilance required of every person in the train, every hour. Henry got sick in the Blue Mountains, not dangerously sick, a cold that went to his chest, a cough that sounded worse than it was, but sick enough that Miriam lay awake listening to his breathing for 3 nights in a row, and on the 2nd of those nights Caleb sat up with her. He did not say much. He had brought coffee, and he handed her some, and they sat outside the wagon in the dark listening to the wind in the pine trees and the sound of Henry coughing occasionally and then stopping. "He'll be all right," Caleb said, at some point in the 2nd hour. "I know," Miriam said. He looked at her. "Do you believe that?" A pause. "Not yet," she said, "but I know it." He nodded and did not say anything else. He stayed until the sky began to lighten in the east, and then he went back to his own wagon and let her sleep for 2 hours before the train moved out. Henry was better by the time they came down out of the Blue Mountains onto the Columbia Plateau. The cough lingered, but the fever had not come, and by the 3rd week of September he was running ahead of the wagon again, which was the surest sign she knew. They reached the Dalles on September 28, 1857, 137 days after leaving Independence, Missouri. The Columbia River wide and cold and gray in front of them, and Oregon just across the water. The last stretch to Oregon City was by river, a raft or a barge down the Columbia through the Cascade Locks, into the Willamette Valley. Miriam booked passage for herself and Henry and left the wagon with a man in the Dalles who gave her a fair price for it, which was not the price she had hoped for, but was enough. Caleb brought his wagon to the same man and took the same price for the same reason. They stood on the riverbank in the October light, pale and cold and particular to the Pacific Northwest in autumn, and Clara stood beside Henry, and both of them were watching the river with the focus of children who have been traveling for 5 months and are almost at the end of something and can feel it. "Your brother-in-law's land," Caleb said. "How far from Oregon City?" 8 miles south, Miriam said. "He wrote that he'd meet me at the landing, and mine is 12 miles east." He paused. "I've never seen it. I bought it from a letter." "You bought land you've never seen." "I bought the idea of it," he said. "That's different." She looked at him. She had spent 5 months looking at this man in the plain pragmatic light of the trail, who he was when things broke, who he was when someone needed driving, who he was at 2 in the morning in the Blue Mountains with a cup of coffee and nothing useful to say and the decency to stay anyway. She had not been looking for anything. She had been very clear with herself about that. "I don't know yet what the land looks like," she said, "or what my brother-in-law has actually built, or whether any of it is what he wrote it would be. I don't know a great deal." "No," he said, "but I know." She stopped. She was not a woman who said things half-formed. She waited until she knew the rest of it. "I know that I am not the same person who left Ohio." Another pause. "And I think that is because of more than the miles." He was looking at the river. He did not look away from it when he said, "I'd like to come see the land if you'll let me. After I've seen mine, I'd like to come and see what you've built and meet your brother-in-law and sit somewhere that isn't moving for long enough to know what that feels like." "You could do that," Miriam said. With the intention of asking something further, he said, "When the time is right for it." She understood what he meant. She stood with it for a moment, the way she stood with most things, steadily, taking its full measure. "You could do that too," she said. The barge came that afternoon. They loaded onto it with Clara and Henry and what remained of what they had carried 2,000 miles, and the Columbia River carried them west through the last of Oregon toward the Willamette Valley and the city at the end of the trail and whatever came next. Henry fell asleep against Miriam's shoulder in the late afternoon, the way he had done since he was an infant, his weight settling into her side with the absolute trust of a child who has never once had reason to doubt the person carrying him. She sat very still so as not to wake him, and watched the banks of the Columbia moving past, the firs dark and enormous, the water the color of pewter, the gray October sky holding its light longer than she expected. Caleb sat beside her, not touching her, not speaking, just present the way he had learned to be, and the way she had, slowly, without meaning to, over 5 months and 2,000 miles, learned to allow. Miriam Holt had left Ohio with a piece of borrowed money, a broken mortgage, and the absolute certainty that she would never be a burden to anyone again as long as she lived. She had built that certainty into something close to a wall, and she had walked behind it for 2 years, and she had intended to walk behind it all the way to Oregon if she had to. She had walked 2,000 miles. Not all of it, but most of it, more than most people will ever walk in a life, and she had come through the other side with something she had not known she was missing because she had told herself so thoroughly that she did not need it. She had come through the other side with someone beside her, not behind her, not ahead of her. Beside, in the diary the last entry dated from the trail reads, Oregon, October 3rd. The river is very wide here. Henry is asleep, I am not afraid. And then, in what appears to be a different hand, added later, perhaps years later, the pencil marks darker and more certain, these words, I was never afraid of the trail. I was afraid of needing. I think I had confused them.